sometimes there is a feeling, a mistaken feeling, that as a matter of fact, when you look at the fascists, they are not the ones who are most hawkish, let us say, on Ukraine. That maybe the fascists are actually interested in peace. That actually, if anything, Donald Trump is supposed to be close to Russia. And therefore, if Biden goes and Trump comes, then even though Trump may be a horrible man, you can at least have some prospects of peace as far as Ukraine is concerned. All that, I regret to say, is not true, because when the fascists come to power, they make an about turn and actually pursue all the policies of aggression, which basically imperialism has been pursuing all these years. This is true of Meloni in Italy, who got elected on the basis of a certain kind of distance from monopoly capital, but having got elected, she's actually doing exactly what monopoly capital wants her to do. And this is also true of Marine Le Pen, whose party has already, before the second round of elections in France on 7th July, has said that, look, I mean, on Ukraine, we are with you. In other words, we don't have any separate views. And Donald Trump actually gave more aid to Zelensky than even subsequently Biden did, because, I mean, everything said and done, there is a certain interest of capitalism, particularly of imperialism, which of course fascism protects, and therefore there is no hope of peaceful fascism in any case, or an end to the kind of wars that we have been seeing. Now, in the third world, this is going to be particularly serious, not just because the tendency to fascism is a global tendency, but also because of the fact that in a period of crisis, the debt of many third world countries increases, because obviously your exports don't grow as rapidly as they would otherwise have done, but your imports continue to be downward inflexible. That being the case, your debt tends to increase. And as your debt tends to increase, I mean, third world debt is now an extremely serious issue. You have to, as long as you remain within the neoliberal framework, within the framework of relatively free commodity trade and financial flows, capital flows, including financial capital flows, you will have to then manage these resources by borrowing internationally, by reaching deals with your lenders to postpone your repayment obligations, and to do all that, you have to accept certain conditionalities. And these conditionalities typically are completely loaded against the working people. This is something which we have seen even in our neighborhood. I mean, you look at a country like Sri Lanka or a country like Pakistan, they are really countries in which the debt burden is one which actually has made the governments accept all kinds of anti-people, anti-worker conditionalities. And this has nothing to do with whether the government is good or bad, whether they want to be kind of ruthless or not vis-a-vis the peasants. They simply have no option. Now, it is in this context that the weakness of contemporary fascism. So what I'm trying to suggest is that therefore it becomes possible to mobilize large masses of people, of workers, of peasants, and so on, all over the world, but of course located in particular countries against fascism. And this is something which becomes also possible for a particular reason. Namely, that exactly the inability of the liberal bourgeois state to find a solution to the ex-ante overproduction crisis that Keynes thought it could is something which is true also of a fascist state. Because even a fascist state, after all, is a nation state. You still have globalized finance and a fascist nation state. One of the reasons why Hitler, or for that matter Japan, which was the first country to come out of the Great Depression in 1931 itself, could manage to come out of the Depression is because they, of course, stepped up military expenditures financed by borrowing, which is what we call a fiscal deficit. So a fiscal deficit could be sold by Hitler to his national finance capital, by the Japanese military fascists to their national finance capital, because of the fact that it was still national finance capital. But the moment you actually have globalized finance, then even a nation state that is ruled by a fascist government would be as incapable of resolving the crisis as any liberal bourgeois nation state would. Therefore, the kind of support, social support, that fascists could mobilize in the 1930s, the kind of classical fascism could mobilize a certain amount of social support, is not something that contemporary fascism can mobilize. And it is this which, together with, as I said, the worsening in the conditions of the working people, really allows the possibility of building up a resistance. Contemporary fascism is precisely because it is not occurring, as Lenin had said that time, in the midst of inter-imperialist rivalry leading to wars. Contemporary fascism is not likely to burn itself through a war, burn itself through an inter-imperialist war and so on. It is something which has to be fought and locally overthrown by the people of the country itself. But insofar as you may get rid of a political fascism, but on the other hand, as long as the economic crisis remains, as long as the conjuncture that produced fascism remains, they would come back to power, exactly as is happening with Donald Trump. Donald Trump had been voted out and everybody had heaved a sigh of relief, but again, he is currently the front runner in the US presidential elections. And the same would happen elsewhere as well. Therefore, to get rid of contemporary fascism, it is important that you have to get rid of the conjuncture that produces fascism. And this conjuncture is one, which I said, is characterized by the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. So you have to overcome the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. You have to overcome the debt crisis of the third world, and you have to have a mobilization of classes that actually pursues an economic agenda which is a different one from the neoliberal economic agenda. Now, this is not at all easy. This is not at all easy because any alternative agenda is something which, because it goes against the interests of globalized finance capital, it would come down like a ton of bricks on any such alternative arrangement. As a matter of fact, you would have sanctions being imposed against you. Harilal referred to the sanctions against Russia. Sanctions against Russia, paradoxically, in fact, one of the paradoxical situations at this moment is that precisely because of the fact that US-led imperialism is beset with all kinds of challenges, the sanctions against Russia ended up strengthening the Russian economy than weakening it. Because you actually find that it is Europe that was reliant upon Russian gas, which is now suffering. And of course, to some extent, it is actually clandestinely importing Russian gas through India. But the point is that it is Europe who's suffering. But on the other hand, in Russia, there is no such kind of breaking of backs as had been predicted. As a matter of fact, quite remarkably, the moment the sanctions were announced, the ruble actually went up. It came down subsequently, but certainly the slogan which was provided at that time, that we shall destroy the ruble and reduce it to rubble, is something that actually has not happened. Now, this actually also holds out a certain hope for the resistance. I know that the moment you wish to de-link from the hegemony of globalized finance capital, there would be all kinds of pressures on you. Two questions arise. First, how do you deal with those pressures? The way to deal with these pressures, of course, is that there must be substantial social support domestically. And that substantial social support can actually be obtained only by having an alternative economic program, which is a program of direct benefit to the people. As a matter of fact, a program of enlarged government expenditure, which actually provides healthcare, which provides education, which provides employment, and it provides education, healthcare, and so on free of cost to everybody, is something which is absolutely essential, at least to make the intent of the government clear and therefore to retain the support of the mass of the people. And this, of course, should be, in my view, done not as a charity on the part of the government that we are giving you free health care, but it should be done as a right. I believe that every citizen, certainly in India, but I would generally suggest, should have justiciable, universal economic right, exactly like we have justiciable, universal, constitutionally guaranteed political rights for free education, free health care, for food, for employment, universal employment, and of course for old age, non-contributory pensions and disability benefits. We made some calculations on this, and it can be financed by simply having two taxes imposed on the top 1% of the population. I'm talking about Indian data. And that is a wealth tax of 2% and an inheritance tax of 1/3, both imposed on the top 1% of the population, which currently, according to Piketty's estimates, owns 40% of the nation's wealth and 24% of the nation's income, of the national income. So just two taxes. I'm glad to see that these days now many voices are talking about wealth and inheritance taxation. These are the best ways of financing such a larger government expenditure. This, of course, would be anti-neoliberal. This goes beyond neoliberalism. But on the other hand, it would actually generate substantial social support for a program that goes beyond neoliberalism. Secondly, at the level of the issues that Professor Harilal was raising about the dollar. Now, it is obvious that the dollar is not going to be replaced by any other currency. In fact, in my view, the dollar should not be replaced by any other currency. We don't want, just as we don't want dollar hegemony, we do not want yuan hegemony, we do not want any hegemony of any other currency. I believe the future should be one in which a number of small countries more or less come together and have agreements among them in order to constitute, if you like, economic units. Like the European community is an economic unit, you could actually have Central African community, which can be an economic unit, South Asian community, which can be an economic unit, and so on, within which trade deficits can be settled by using their own currencies, much the way that we used to have with the Soviet Union in the old days, where you had the rupee arrangements, rupee-ruble arrangements. The exchange rate between the rupee and the ruble was fixed. And of course, if you had a deficit, then the deficit remained, but over a period of time, you sold enough goods to make good the deficit. In other words, local arrangements, not an international arrangement that replaces the dollar hegemony by some other reserve currency's hegemony, is what I would advocate. I am completely opposed to free trade. Let me make it very clear. I believe all theories of free trade are bogus theories. You look at Ricardo's theory of free trade. Ricardo's theory of free trade argues, I mean, it gives an example about England and Portugal trading, where England sells cloth to Portugal, Portugal sells wine to England. The presumption behind that theory of comparative advantage is that both countries can grow both commodities. But England cannot grow wine. It is simply not possible for England to grow wine. As a result, all the theories that argue that trade is mutually beneficial, free trade is better than, I remember teaching all this in my kind of salad years, free trade is better than restricted trade is better than no trade, and so on and so forth. Completely bogus. But the point is that, of course, I'm not saying we should not trade, but on the other hand, trade should be based on an actual evaluation of the advantages to particular countries, not that they get locked into particular situations of specialization. Therefore, I would really suggest that a welfare program financed by wealth and inheritance taxation that goes beyond the kind of neoliberal limits, and at the same time, local trade arrangements that break the hegemony of the dollar are the way forward. Of course, what steps you take, how you go, are issues that I would not go into. But that is absolutely essential and that requires obviously the support, a kind of social support that can come from the working people, which is absolutely essential for going beyond neoliberalism. And at the moment, neoliberalism, which is the preferred, which is the policy that is thrust by globalized finance capital on the entire world, has pushed the world to a situation where wars are going to become intensified, where fascism is rising its head, but where the crisis continues, people's suffering continues. We have to go beyond this. Thank you very much.